I bet you haven't heard this story about this Indigenous woman in Colonial Haiti. I'm Andre, and I'm a genealogist who helps people to discover their history. In the conversation of the Indigenous peoples of Haiti, a lot is said. A lot of it has no basis in truth, and when things are mentioned, there's oftentimes general statements being made. We don't hear of any particular Indigenous people who we know by name that lived underneath French colonial rule. This ends now. Last year, I was combing through French colonial records for Saint-Domingue, marriages, baptisms, burials, and I stumbled across by accident a record of an indigenous woman who lived underneath French colonial rule. It sent me on a journey to learn as much as I could about her. I combed through the records, finding any shreds of evidence, and putting them together with the historical context, I was able to stitch together a part of her story. Now, the pieces of information that I did find about her are indeed that. They are pieces. So we are limited as to what we can know. But in stitching them together, I think we can see a little bit of her life. I do have to give a warning. Her story contains elements that are disturbing. So, trigger warning. Let me tell you a little about Marie-Victoire Delacroix. What is extremely fascinating is that she was born sometime around 1679. Based on what a priest recorded about her, it seems that she was from the swamplands in the western side of the colony. This area would have been in the cul-de-sac plain, in what is now known as the second section of Varro in the town of Croix-du-Bouquet in modern-day Haiti. Given that she was from this location, it's possible that she was a Taino, a descendant of those who survived the violence of Spanish colonial rule 200 years before. Furthermore, she was born in an area that did not have French colonial rule until 8 years afterwards. This means that she was born in an area that did not have any French colonists, so she witnessed their arrival. About 8 years after she was born, colonists in Léogâne around 1686 had left Léogâne and went over to the cul-de-sac plain. They saw this land as being well suited for their plans of plantation agriculture, and this ignited a huge wave of colonists to arrive to the cul-de-sac plain. They came from France, England, Holland, Canada, Spain, as well as other Caribbean colonies such as Nevis, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Saint Croix, Saint Christophe. They all began scrambling for land in the cul-de-sac plain. One of these newly arrived colonists was a man named Charles Blanchard, who came from the town of Honfleur in the Normandy region in France. He too decided that he wanted a parcel of land in the plain. As several acres of land were being claimed by colonists, Blanchard decided he wanted to have some land too. On the northern edge of the settlement in the plain, he grabbed a parcel of land. Want to guess where it was near? You guessed it, the swamplands. This is a 1713 map of the land that the colonists had grabbed. Taking a closer look, below we see Blanchard's land, and over here is the swamp. Now, the details of how Victoire and Blanchard met are not known, but given the context of the time, there is a possible explanation for it. What we need to keep in mind is that to be non-white, regardless of any perceived differences in gender, meant that they were violable. This was the violent foundation the French laid in its establishment of Saint-Domingue. When Blanchard and Victoire met, sometime between 1679 and 1699, over 2,090 captive Africans had been forcibly trafficked into Saint-Domingue. Many of those were forced to be in the cul-de-sac plain. Additionally, in 1683, French buccaneers kidnapped over 1,500 indigenous and African-descended women from Campeche and Veracruz, Mexico, where they were brought to Saint-Domingue and forced to be the captive wives of European men. Many of these women were forced to go to the cul-de-sac plain. So it is not improbable that Victoire had been forcibly captured in the swamp by Blanchard to be his concubine. Given the time period, it is possible that Victoire was in her early teenage years around 1695 when Blanchard impregnated her. Her pregnancy resulted in the birth of a baby girl named Thérèse. She was again impregnated by Blanchard around 1697, resulting in the birth of another baby girl named Suzanne. Neither of these girls had a baptism recorded, or at least it hasn't been found. It is perhaps because Victoire was not a Catholic. And this would have been an act of resistance. Something that you need to know about Saint-Domingue and Catholicism. In 1685, the French king enacted a set of laws to govern his colonies. One of these laws prohibited the practices of all religions except Roman Catholicism. Catholicism was forced upon all inhabitants. Now that Victoire was underneath French colonial rule, eventually it meant that she had to comply. Around 1699, after another child was born, named after his father, a priest was operating as a missionary and entered into the cul-de-sac plain seeking to convert people and made his way to their residence. It appears that his visit was somewhat successful, at least being able to baptize little Charles. It is very possible that when he baptized the infant that he explained Catholicism's belief about the importance of baptizing an infant so that it would secure his place in heaven and not go to hell in case of early death. This record marks Victoire's first entrance into the archive. Perhaps this record marks the day when Victoire was forced to accept or at least comply with France's law of mandatory Catholicism. Sadly, Victoire did lose her son after his baptism. They didn't take him to the priest to be buried, or at least it hasn't been recorded, again suggesting possible resistance. But as colonization grew, so did the religion's influence. In 1702, Victoire gave birth to another son, named after his father and deceased brother, and she and Blanchard took him to the priest to be baptized. Perhaps it was during this visit that the priest pressured Victoire and Blanchard to promise to be married, because in this record, it records that they made a promise to do so. Going back to the King of France's law, it stated that they could not contract any marriage unless it was Catholic, and any children born underneath that union to be bastards, and that union was concubinage. It's possible that during this visit, the priest explained to them Catholicism's belief that their union was sinful and that they were headed towards damnation if they did not marry underneath Catholic ceremony. He would have emphasized that their children were illegitimate and that a marriage underneath Catholic ceremony would have legitimized them and wiped away from them the stain of illegitimacy. It's possible that when a promise was made that they would marry, it was to stop the pressure of this priest. We also see that during this visit, Victoire starts being recorded with the names Marie and Delacroix soon afterwards, highlighting Catholicism's influence. In being recorded as Mary of the Cross, it suggests that she had converted to Catholicism, or at least was complying with mandatory Catholicism, because to reemphasize, it was against the law to not be Catholic. So Victoire's agency is non-existent. Although a promise was made to get married, they didn't do so right away. In fact, it didn't happen until 2 years later. Maybe it was Victoire's own doing. Before they did marry, Victoire had been impregnated by Blanchard again, giving birth to another child, a boy named Louis. But not too long after his birth, after 2 years of postponing this marriage, a Catholic ceremony was finally performed. On October 13, 1704, Victoire and Blanchard traveled down to the wooden chapel and solemnized their union underneath the Catholic ceremony of marriage. The very next day, they brought their son Louis to be baptized by the priest, highlighting their compliance with French law. We need to understand that Victoire's conversion or compliance with Catholicism was for her survival. In assimilating the values and culture of those who wielded the power to harm her, adopting or at least appearing to comply was meant to reduce harm. This was a way that colonized people endured. However, assimilating into the French colonial system further colonized Victoire. This is seen in her at least being the owner of at least one slave. Just 5 months before her own marriage, Victoire had gone down to the priest and given her permission for her slave Claire to marry a free black man. There's a lot that we don't know. We don't know how she came to own Claire or if she owned even more slaves. It's possible that she knew the king's law that stated if a slave married a free person, they would be free. We don't know if Victoire intentionally gave her permission so that she would no longer be an owner of Claire. Regardless, the fact that Claire was recorded as Marie Victoire's property showcases the fact that as Victoire was assimilating into the French culture, she was being compliant in the anti-Black society that she was forced to be underneath. Following through with mandated Catholicism and becoming a slave owner showcases the progression of assimilation due to France's colonizing force. We know that she went on to have 3 more children, and the last mention of her in the record is in 1713. Unfortunately, we don't know any more about her or her children. but what we do know is both sad and incredible.